Sorry about that. So yeah, so thank you guys for all the breakouts. Joined most of the rooms and great discussions going on. So for this one, we'll go in the same order we went last time, and we'll have Pedro up first, and he can just present the PowerPoint report out. That'd be great, and walk through that if there's any questions. And then just make sure we upload that to the master deck so I can include them in the notes. So with that, I'll turn it over to reference architecture and Pedro and Miguel.
Thanks, Kim. Let me share my screen. Can you guys see this?
Yes, we can.
Okay, it's not full screen, but I hope it's clearly visible. So the goal for the reference architecture and V2 build, because we now have the reference architecture in a very nice shape and it's pretty much done, the goal for the next PI is to deliver the alpha version or the alpha release of the next version, V2. And for that, we have thought about splitting the work in 4 main epics, or 4 epic groups, because there's some breaking up in there. The first one is to deliver the initial versions of the foundational cross-cutting concerns, so things like security, auditing, platform configuration, and the likes. We need a minimum version of that, what we are calling the foundational, because some of those aspects will go into everything that we build after. So the first couple of weeks or the first few weeks we'll be building that. And that's the first epic that we have to work on. The second epic, and this is something that we can likely do in parallel with the third one, the second epic is actually to be broken up into multiple other epics. And this is where we focus on getting the happy path and the stable interfaces for things like the interoperability bounded context and the participants and the transfers, counts and balances, quotes, lookups, settlements, notifications, and so on. So this is where we actually put the functionality of the alpha release. Mind you that this is only the happy path and the stable interfaces. So this is not by any means production ready or feature complete. So this is, we were considering that this is actually a big epic. So epic number 2 will be split between, something showed up in my screen. Well, so this is going to be split by the bounded context. And then the third epic, which is something that we can actually do in parallel. It really depends on how many resources we will have. But the third epic is about getting the initial versions of the rest of the cross-cutting concerns and all of them, not just the ones that are needed for the epic 2. So not just security, audit, platform configuration, and the likes, but everything else that we need to get done. And this is something that we think can be done in parallel with the epics in number 2. And then finally, what we need is a plan for the next release, which is hopefully a release candidate, a beta, or something that gets us very close to a production ready. So these are the epics and the objectives that we have defined for PI 15. Now, what we're not doing, and this is, I know I'm repeating, but it's important to stress out, what we're not doing is we're not doing a feature complete release. Alpha version is not going to be anything looking like a beta or something like a release candidate version, which means it's not going to be deployable by a customer and it's nowhere near being a production ready. What this is just that technical release that will allow our developers to start reshaping everything that was built meanwhile to the future versions so that they can do this with a higher degree of confidence. And it's obviously a stepping stone for that beta release and the release candidate version. We changed a bit the format here. And we took the liberty of adding a risk issue section. This is a very special work stream in the sense that what we're doing has a chunk of realizable value, and it doesn't necessarily, it's not easy to deliver half the value with half the resources or with half the time. So that is not a linear relation between resources and dedicated team versus the value that we release. So we have to be calling out for these risks and these issues. So the first one is that lack of dedicated resources will slow down the deliverable. What we mean by this is that if we have less dedicated resources, we can still do this. It just takes longer. Now, if the progress is too slow and eventually we lose momentum, this initiative will feel impossible. And what I mean by this is that if it drags on for too long, we will create the feeling that this is not, either this is impossible, or this is not desirable, or we were just building a pipe dream that is not something that we can actually do. And this is something that we've seen in the past, and I've experienced in the past with other projects, where if it drags on for too long, it looks like we made the wrong decision, when actually what the wrong decision was to not be committed to doing it. So this is one of those issues, or one of those projects or initiatives that we have to commit a minimum amount of effort and dedication to achieve something. Otherwise, it's not interesting. And obviously, the longer it takes to get to this V2 version, which is aligned with the reference architecture, the more expensive it is to migrate whatever we do during V1 to that V2. So essentially that boils down to technical debt will be accumulating on V1, which makes it harder to migrate to V2, and it makes it harder to convince people to move them to V2. So this is what we're not doing, and the risks and issues. So how do we define our success? It's funny enough, this is the very easy thing to define. With all resources ready by the 9th of August, so in 1 week time, we are very confident that we can deliver the alpha version by the end of PI 15 and a plan for the next PI. That plan will be obviously what a beta version will look like for, and a release candidate. If we don't have all the resources, we can still deliver something. Mind you that there's a minimum number of resources, or a minimum amount of resources for this to be realizable. But without all the resources, but having some, we can deliver a subset of the alpha version, that we will reshape the order of it. So maybe we don't deliver all of the bounded context that we have. Maybe we focus on the most important things, like the participants, the transfers, the counterbalances, and the settlement, and we leave out the other parts to be done in PI 16. So we can do that. And obviously, we will also release a plan for whatever is left to be done in next PI. So that is the result of our breakout, and that is what we think we should do to deliver the next version of the platform. That's it. So back to you, Ken.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay. Miguel, anything else, or you're good?
No, I think Pedro
Perfect.
summed it
Okay.
up nicely.
Thank you.
There was a question from Paula on
Yeah.
this.
Oh, go ahead, Paul.
From Paula. It was in the chat asking.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as we've mentioned in some of the other breakouts, resources are always a challenge, but being specific about the types of resources, both the skill set and the quantity, number of hours, et cetera, would be really helpful to have more specifics in that regard.
Yes, we need, and this is something that we probably missed in this slide. We need 4 to 6 developers that are dedicated to this initiative. So that's the range, 4 to 6. 6 means that we can deliver all of this. 4 means that we can deliver a valuable chunk of this, and it's just slower. It just takes longer, so we won't be able to release all of this by the end of the PI, but we can still deliver a significant part, which is valuable enough. Less than 4 dedicated developers, it's going to be really difficult, because then we go into that losing momentum that often gets confused to why are we doing this? Because we're not getting anywhere. So that's something that we missed in here. Apologies for that. So 4 to 6 dedicated developers, and the developers, we have the profile for the developers in the presentation of the reference architecture. It's a good point. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, and if folks can mention that too, that'd be great. Okay, so Paul, I think you're up in the business operations framework.
Sorry,
Warren, aren't you going to present?
Or
Yeah,
Warren,
yeah.
sorry, I didn't know
Okay.
this.
No problem. Actually, but Paul, can I get your screen up, please?
Sure.
So we've also added our content into the deck. Coming up.
There you go.
Okay, I'm hopefully on a better link this time, but please shout if it's terrible. And Paul can help me out if I miss anything. So we had Finn from Works with us on this call, which was invaluable because actually we had some first-hand experience from Hub Operator and the pains that they were facing. So thank you very much for that. And that really helped us focus in on immediate needs and things that the community will feel benefit from. So then if I miss anything, please feel free to add in. So looking at the overall goal for this PI for the next 12 weeks, it's to have a framework in place. So it's the definition of the RBAC, it's the operational API, and how we use those in the operational APIs that control access to things, that how we instrument effectively the interfaces, and a demonstration of our front-end strategy. We looked at 4 key epics that we would explore. Now, we do actually have some epics in GitHub, but we might have to refine those and reprioritize, but yeah, that's exactly what this planning session is for, so that's fine. And as you read through them, you'll see that 1 and 2 are the wrong way around. But in terms of logical sequencing, but for number 1, it's about your compliance officer. Can I actually access that operator trail? Can I see what everybody else has done in the platform? And you can see that obviously that means that we have the infrastructure in place for identity, authentication, authorization, and the access control tests that are needed around that. Secondly, as a hub operator, I can define those roles and I can apply those roles to new users as we are bringing them on. So that they can access reports or not be able to access reports, or trigger events or not be able to do them. Thirdly, it's looking as a DFSP. So this is an external entity actually being able to query an API on the hub that says, please provide for me the reconciliation report that I need to complete my settlement processes. My settlement processes, and this is the settlement process of CB Bank or CBA or whoever that is actually connecting to the platform. And fourthly, to actually, as a hub operator, have that detailed investigation capability. So we kind of had the concept of, big screen versus small screen. We have monitoring and alerting and that kind of big screen stuff that happens in the operations center, but actually we want to be able to, this is a small screen requirement. Can I go in and investigate a particular transaction when customer care is dealing with a incident? So being able to go through and do that. Can't quite see on the screen there, but we have broken down success criteria in this space. So, I don't think I need to go through all of them exactly over here, but it is making sure we've got that framework in place, making sure that we have the ability to configure the framework, making sure that we have the ability to add people into the framework. So if you like, that's a slow speed, medium, and high speed type activity, right? Or changing events that we want to be able to really say, do we have the infrastructure in place? Have we instrumented the APIs? Those are code-based changes. Are we able to actually, as a hub operator, manage our policies and schemas? And then once we're in operation mode and a new person joins my team, can I actually give them access and give them appropriate access to do the job? And then in our second list, number one, we have DFSP's been able to operate the report, which is really the Epic for 3. And then for all of them, what we're saying is there needs to be that end-to-end demonstration. We really want to, for both for Epics 3 and 4, be able to show that we can add that user, get them engaged onto the platform with the appropriate access, make sure that we can execute the services they're meant to be able to, and we can see that audit trail. But that's not enough. We actually need to be able to show that a user is also denied access. If they're not a valid user without the correct authorization, that they cannot actually access those things. And of course, there is an element of make a checker in there. So that's how we're looking at this, the definition of success here. We know that we won't be having pretty UIs for everything we're doing here. So for instance, the configuration is one area called out, might just be the JSON configuration file, but there will be a process to deploy that securely that makes it meaningful. We did think about some other areas. In fact, I didn't list all the areas we thought about around, liquidity management was a big area in the DFSP portal itself, and we spoke a lot about the participant lifecycle management, and certainly the ability to onboard, but actually that went down the priority list for this 12-week period. All right, I think I've covered everything off there. Paul, is there anything else I've not touched on?
Did you get a confidence vote from the team?
If they all high five now on Zoom, we can get a confidence vote very quickly.
While we're looking at that confidence vote, Warren, what's the gap on resourcing? Is this resourced or?
So yes, there's a gap on resourcing. We definitely want to make sure that we get some UX support in this. We've had some commitment to resource the back-end work, but we will need support from the wider community for the user interface work around that. So we will, I think Paul in the earlier presentation had updated some of those, but we will work with Simeon to get a note out on these are the particular skill sets that we need.
Excellent. Thank you.
You want to put a conference vote, and then that'd be great. And then we can hand it off to Michael.
So, if I could ask everyone just to maybe in the chat, because that'll be an easy way for me to count, or do a thumbs up and I can do a quick count on the Zoom participant list.
Okay, shall I get going then? So our plan is, by the end of this PI, to have a demonstrable version of Moduloop which uses ISO 20022 messages internally for P2P and P2B, that is customer initiated P2B, and hopefully an FXP demonstrator as well. So the key epics here are, first of all, we need to make some Moduloop adapter changes at the switch, so that the switch can receive messages in native ISO format and they can be converted by the modular loop adapter and placed on the Kafka queue so that the existing processing methods in the switch can work on them. We need mappings for the Rwanda version for all 6 ISO 20022 messages that comprise an end-to-end transfer. We need them to be convertible to and from FSP IOP messages. Quite a lot of that work is done, but it needs to be completed. We need to have API and Swagger definitions for the ISO 20022 messages. And finally, we need an FXP simulator. Oh, sorry, it's not finally. We need also an ISO usage definition for modular loop payments. That is a document that explains how to do a modular loop style payment using ISO 20022 documents. So that'll be the beginning, I think, of one of the artifacts that we will be proposing to the ISO folks once we become part of their community. And finally, we need to look at and make in the initial form ISO message modifications for modular loop payments. That is to say, where the ISO message standard needs to be changed to accommodate the way in which we think things should be done, we will start making that change. What we're not doing, but will be important, is looking at how to generalize this usage in the modular loop context. Now, as I say, we're going to concentrate on a particular implementation for this PI. But one of the things we will have to do eventually is to have some sort of some detailed statements about how, in general, implementers should use ISO 20022 messages in a modular loop context. And finally, we will have to have a detailed statement of how we propose to change the ISO message definitions to accommodate modular loops requirements. And those will be in the form of a business justification, which is an ISO 20022 internal format document. Success is defined by one customer running an ISO native modular loop on real rails. That's for the ISO stuff, and for the FXP stuff, we have a demonstratable sandbox which includes currency conversion. From a resourcing point of view, most of the ISO work is resourced. We have a request in to bring in the services of an ISO subject matter expert, and that will essentially be for to help with items 5 and 6 on the epics. That is to say, the more ISO focused areas of things. Situation is somewhat less clear in relation to the FXP stuff. Quite a lot of that stuff is resourced, but we will need some development help with setting up a simulator to manage, to participate as an FXP in a modular loop simulator system. So that's that really. Confidence vote, it must be said there weren't that many of us there, but we nevertheless, we managed to keep our confidence levels up, and we think it's probably around 4, because it can't be 5. And that's it. Does anyone have any questions? In which case,
sorry, Michael.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Quick question I thought about at the start, and I just remembered. So the ML adaptive changes at the switch, I think there's going to be a bit of crossover with the reference architecture work.
We got the right screen, yes. Let's check that. Okay, I'll assume we have. Okay, so
yeah, your desktop is showing.
So my desktop is showing. Oh,
Yeah,
great. Okay.
it's a lovely desktop, but it's
lovely, but it's the wrong one. Try that. Any better?
That works.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you. It would be really good if Zoom could actually validate that. Everybody has to go through the same check. Anyway, merchant payments. So our goal for the next PI is to have a validated hypothesis of what the right set of modules in OSS would be. In other words, make sure that we're heading in the right direction as opposed to actually doing it. So we've defined 5 epics around this. First of all, I think numbers 1 and 3 really relate to the same thing, merchant lifecycle management. So first of all, do we know what data we need to know at the center? How can we limit it so we can avoid privacy, data leakage issues, etc.? What is the minimum set of data that we need in order to do block listing, because we want to be able to turn a merchant off if they've been misbehaving or suspected of money laundering or fraud or whatever it is. So what's that minimum set of data? And we want to understand the gaps at the center in the processes around merchant lifecycle management. We think that we can use ALS and the Oracle APIs as is. If not, what are the gaps? What do we need to extend it to support that merchant lifecycle management piece? So Epic 1 is all about onboarding, really, onboarding a merchant onto the system. Epic 2 is all about demonstrating the block list, demonstrating that we can recognize the state of a merchant and interdict a transaction in live. So identify the best place for this. Should it be inside the hub? Should it be outside the hub? We're also looking at Actio to doing an up-to-date block list state to facilitate that. So the goal out of this epic is a paper that outlines the choices, plus a demo of a transaction being stopped because we've changed the state of a merchant. Third, we need to have clarity on QR codes, the standards to be used. We agree, I think, that a standard does not imply, and use of a standard does not imply endorsement of business practices, for example. So we think that maybe we could use the EMVCO standard and bend it to our needs. Make sure, just because Visa and MasterCard use it doesn't mean that we can't use it, and make it, and that would actually in the future potentially support things like international transactions. We'll develop a paper on that and how we might use the standard, and in particular how our implementation wouldn't impact on what Visa choose to do, which is probably quite important.
Could I step in just for a minute before
Sure.
you move on too far, to be sure that we put some clarity around that too, that remembering that it's not a standard, it's actually a specification published by a closed user group, and they can at any time decide to change the rules on which they promulgate that specification, and what they require for people who use it, because they hold the intellectual property. So because it's not an open standard, we should tread lightly. And I'm not taking away from what you're saying, that if we figure out a way to add peer-to-peer payment and merchant request payment credentials to what was intended to be track data carried in a card format, then if we can figure out a way to do that in a way that's open, it's a much more embraceful approach for many implementers who do care to have cards and also non-card based systems in a single QR code. But I don't want us to get stopped there and say it has to be that.
Oh God, no, absolutely not. Sorry, so absolutely not. It's just a good starting point.
Because we'd be hooking our wagon to a proprietary specification for which we cannot control, and we, by the way, don't have any input to. We can't actually even give them comments on what we like or don't like about it. And that to me, it feels kind of creepy that we'd be taking a dependency on something like that. But anyway, we should probably wait for your paper. Like, what would that be? But please also say, and what if we didn't do that? You know, we just use a URI-based system like we've been exploring before.
Yeah, I suppose what I have in my mind, Miller, is taking it and forking it, essentially. So using it as a starting point. And I think the chances of it changing significantly from what it is are in a way that would fundamentally affect us are very small, because they would impact on so many of their members, on so many of the scheme's members very badly. So I think taking it and forking it so that we can reuse it for our purposes, I think that's probably the most
right. We do need to get a legal opinion, though, but we will need to get a legal opinion from the foundation attorneys as to whether we have the right to produce a derivative and what we can do with that. I will point out that you can completely ignore it and do a URI-based system that you have full control over for the first step to show how a QR code system was developed, where the issuer has complete control over it and it's not dependent on the commercial cloud system or commercial card systems. And we have explored that. There are other examples, such as what is done for Alipay, where they use a combination of a URL-based system that then redirects to the URI, so that they either have a way of just reading it with your camera directly without having to have the app open first. There's some subtleties to the form you put that QR code in that are on top of what the actual data format that's being transacted is.
Absolutely.
And I think some exploration ought to be done there. There is a level 1 project report on QR code that was emitted by our collective community, including Glenbrook Partners, that explored some of the facets of QR codes as they're deployed by others. And of course, as you well have recognized, many of the successful ones, such as the Thailand and Singapore one, are based on Invico formats. So deciding what it is they did that we might do also and how they went about it would be a very useful early step in this, to be sure we don't take a dependency on something that we lose control over.
I think that you're quite right. That paper is an important element of the deliverables from this particular work stream, and I think that we as a group would probably seek to work quite closely with you on that, Miller, to make sure this is heading in the right direction. On the next point, we want to develop interoperable PayMe as a deliverable demo. This is again relating to merchant lifecycle management. So by interoperable PayMe, we mean that an alias for a merchant effectively divorces the link between that merchant and the bank account or DFS account, whatever it might be, so that they can change it without changing their merchant ID. Moving their account between different operators, and we want to be able to demonstrate that we can make a payment to a merchant to their merchant ID. The merchant can then change the underlying account, and we carry on as though nothing's happened. And we can do that. We think we can do that pretty easily with the existing infrastructure. But out of that, we'd want to produce a set of assets, including the product flows, the process flows, the product assets, etc. And we added a fifth epic, which is to road test our thinking at DFS Labs, the event that they are going to be hosting, to get more contributions to this. What we're not doing now, we're not producing any new code. We're not looking at the crypto architecture that we would need to protect if we were doing QR codes. We're very actively aware of the various attacks against QR codes, and we want to protect against that. It's just not in this PI. Also, we're not making any changes to the APIs for merchant lifecycle management, but we think that with our epics 1, 2, 4, we'll have a pretty good idea of the gaps by the end of this phase. How do we define success? Well, we've got 4 definitions of success here. First, we will be able to UAT the existing merchant scenarios. In particular, we want to show that there is data that clearly indicates that a transaction which goes through is a merchant transaction, so that it's not a P2P transaction or anything like that. We can identify it clearly as a merchant transaction and treat merchant transactions differently, in particular with in relation to the block list and the know your merchant stuff. We want to essentially use this as is as much as possible and use that process in order to find the gaps that we need to address in the future PIs. We will produce a set of suggested documents and demos out of this, as I've already talked about in the epics, and these we hope will exist permanently. And we also have the ambition that the concept of the block list should, and the implementation approach we're identifying, will be accepted into the Mojo Loop architecture. that's everything from me. I can open it to questions. I was aware as I was talking that a lot of people were doing a lot of messaging on the chat line, but I have no idea what they were saying.
Paul, one thing you could help us address is the resourcing for this. Where do you feel you are at this point, and what resources do you lack that you need? I appreciate, by the way, that your confidence is not only bold, but in a very large font size.
Yep. We're very confident about this, Miller.
Awesome. But if you could go through a little bit of, who would you like to come help you, and what skills do they have?
Right. So we had a group of people in the session earlier on. We think that between us, we have at this stage significant knowledge on the merchant lifecycle piece and the Actio information on how to do block listing. And Lewis is very up on the pay me stuff. It's already begun some work, some related work on that. Essentially, we haven't actually come up with a view of the number of man months of work that are involved in this. We feel sure it can be completed within this BI. We've got a confidence level of 4 here. More help would be very welcome. I think there were 4 or 5 people that volunteered assistance on this. So, but to be honest, there is a lot of work around this, particularly around the merchant lifecycle management and how that relates to DFSPs and independent teams of merchant onboarding agencies. There's a lot of work to go into it. So if anyone else is willing to volunteer, then we'd be very keen to have you. Yep. Yeah, and I see Leslie Ann has actually listed it again in the chat line. So there we go.
And a little bit of coding just from our side as well, from the next takeover. From that perspective, there's work that we need to do, but we're happy to fund that from our side. So I think from everything we discussed, between the various activities already in flight, a lot of the code exists, just needs to be quickly aligned, and we're in a good place.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll stop sharing.
Great. Thank you, guys. Thank you for those great report outs. And the work is just beginning. So I hope folks continue to get engaged, sign up resources, and get plugged in as we progress to take these high-level presentations and put them into GitHub epics and user stories on our Moduloop repository. So if you want to get involved, please reach out to the workstream owners, reach out to myself, Simeon, or Leslie Ann, and we will make sure you're plugged into the right place. So with that, I'll hand it over to Simeon to close us out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kim, and thank you so much, everybody. One of the things that I do want to highlight here for everyone, it's been very clear to me throughout the presentations over the last 2 days that most of the teams have very clear, very specific asks and very specific call to actions. One of the things that I'm very willing to help you all with is to figure out where you can provide your skill and your knowledge so that we can advance all this wonderful work that we've listed down. So again, thank you so much for spending the last 2-3 days with us. This event has been very inward focused, mostly looking at all work streams and all the awesome work that everyone's doing. And I'm looking forward to engaging and working with you all to get it to the next level. I want to pass it over to Paula, but maybe before I do, Miller, do you have any closing remarks?
Just briefly that, we've had a lot of excitement, and today in particular, I saw a lot of engagement in the work stream work, and that's just really gratifying to see that we're making plans to move this thing to the next level. But I also reflect back on the 5 years we've been working on this, and it's really incredible the journey we've been on, and we've created so much in the meantime. And Paula and company have now brought some structure to this that we lacked in the first couple of years. And I was looking at some of the early convenings that we had, and Simeon, that you and Paula and Leslie Ann are really, and the team behind the scenes have brought some structure to this that we just didn't have back in those days. And that's very rewarding to see that. So I appreciate everyone's attendance, and very happy to see the community form around this super important project, piece of work. Thank you.
Awesome. I'll pass it over to Paula.
Great. Thank you, Simeon. Thanks for those comments, Miller. Appreciate it. So I agree that it was some great report outs today, and I want to thank Leslie Ann and Simeon and Kim for kind of restructuring the reporting today, because I think you've come up with a really crisp template that makes it easier for everyone kind of at a glance to get a sense of where we are going with the next program increment. I think the one thing that you saw a theme this morning, the ask from myself, from Miller and others, the resources, what specific resources are needed to achieve these objectives. And, we went from as many as 4 or 5 full-time developers for reference architecture to, merchant payments being, we generally have, critical mass, but could use some additional domain expertise. And certainly I expect we'll need assistance with the documentation and demos for merchant payments. And I saw Paul articulated more specifics about BizOps, and of course I'm in the loop with Michael on ISO. But let's make sure that we really drill down on those resource requirements next week, that Simeon has a good understanding of what the asks are for the community, so that we can accelerate volunteerism and contribution to your various initiatives. So again, thank you for shifting your reporting to this new format. I think it'll be really helpful, and it's great to have a uniform template that everyone can recognize and very quickly get a snapshot on our progress. A couple of other things just to point out: we have some other projects that are ongoing that we didn't talk about this week. One in particular with the Monetary Authority of Singapore. I hope that we'll be able to get more specific in at our October event, but we really don't want to distract the resources that are working on the core platform with the work with MAS. But the community will hear more details in the upcoming weeks and months about what's going on in that project and how you can participate in parallel, I hope, with that initiative. It's a very exciting project and has really given us a lot of exposure internationally. And then finally, we don't want to forget about the business folks that are an important part of our ecosystem. As I noted earlier this week, we had a recent webinar on PISP that was very well attended. We're planning another one. Our marketing steering group is helping guide us on what the topic should be for those webinars. But they're also working with us on developing a set of themes for a September business-oriented conference. More details to come, but on tomorrow we're actually kicking off the planning for that. And again, some of you are participating via the marketing steering committee to help us shape the content and speakers for that event. If you're interested in learning more, let me know. I'll hook you up with the marketing steering group so that you're involved in the planning cycles for that. But again, that business community is equally important, particularly as we focus on adoption. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention this week. I know we're all suffering with a bit of Zoom fatigue, but I think it was really productive. I think particularly the breakouts have been very useful. Would like to remind you to take a moment to fill out our post-event survey that Alyssa has posted in the chat, and wish you a successful program increment. So with that, I'll thank you all again and pass it back to Simeon to close out.
I will return to you some time left from I think about half an hour. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good rest of your day, whatever's left of it. and we will see each other next week. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.